Do it. Actually, let me start. Some people were done with assignment 8, and that's great. Some people were still having trouble. So let me, before going into inheritance, let's do something quickly with arrays and objects and stuff like that, right? Imagine that you're going to represent a phone book, like this stuff on your phone, your contacts, right? What do you have for each one of the entries in your phone book, in your contacts thing?
Name and number.
Name and number, right? Okay, sounds good. We can do first and last name and stuff like that, but string, phone, number, right? What is a phone number? That's a good question, but let me cheat and make them public. Or let's do them. Wait, where? Make them private. Where do we do system out print line or not? Yeah, let's make them public. Right? We are defining our class, right? There is no print line yet, right? We probably want to define a constructor just for fun. Somebody had asked, what's a phone number, right? Should it be a string or an int or something like that, right? That one, to me, semantically, is halfway there, right? What's an int? What kinds of things do you do to an int? No, what kinds of operations do you do on an int? Addition, subtraction, right? Do you ever add phone numbers? No. So they are somewhere in between, right? And if you do, how long is a phone number? Do you put the dashes or not? So it's like, you can do either way. Let's make them a string, just for fun. So let's create a constructor. I'm not going to do the getters and setters because I'm lazy and because I don't want to make this too big. And then maybe a toString, right? And we are going to mark that we are overriding it just in case. Public string toString. Something like this, right? So that's my entry, right? Has a name, a phone number. I defined a constructor, made my instance variables public, and I defined the toString, right? Now, my phone number, my phone book, right, is going to have a bunch of this, right? How many? Well, I don't know, right? So how can I cheat for now? We'll see better collections. But for now, how can I cheat? Well, I can define an array of entries, right? Let's say that I put 100 entries, right? Could initialize it here or in the constructor for the phone book. But the fact that I have an array with 100 slots, does that tell me how many entries I actually have in the phone book? No, that's my total space, right? That's the blank lines. So I need to have something representing how many entries do I have right now, right? So let's assume that I have an add entry method. Let's say that I'm gonna, for the user of this class, let's say that I'm gonna have string name, string phone number. rather than an entry, right? So I need to create an entry. Now, how do I put it inside this array, right? I could do, is this good enough? What's the problem with this? And how do I want to use this? Let's do this would sort of work for this kind of stuff, right? But what happens if I do something like this, right? Would this code for add entry work? What would happen if I called this and then this? How many entries do I have now in my phone book? Only one, because I just overrode the other one, right? So what do I need to do? Well, change how do I put it, right? The first entry that I add, I'm going to put it in place number 0. The next one, I'm going to put it in place number 1. The next one, I'm going to put it in place number 2, right? Does that make sense? So what I need to do, I'm keeping here my number of entries, so, and then I do this, so that the next time I'm putting it to number 1, right? The next time I'm putting it to number 2. So I could have other kinds of things like public int get entries. Or let's do public void print all, and let's pass it a print stream. What do I do here? What do I out? I'm going to do out.println, right? But what do I do? Can I do this? I can, but it doesn't do. So what do I need to do? I need some sort of for loop, right, to go through all my entries, right? For int I equals 0, I less than. What happens if I do entries.length? Less, right?
It starts at 0. So
Well, yeah, it starts at 0, so it ends. But the problem is that how many entries, if I did this, how many entries I actually have? 2, but I have 100 slots. So I'm going to print 98 pieces of manure, right? So I need to do something like num entries, right? So I could do that should print those things. Maybe. Isn't this runnable? Let me get out of this so that I can change it. View, let me exit presentation mode. Oops, this is executing old stuff, so let's go change it. And instead of this, I'm gonna print March20 dot as my main, right? And it's telling me you don't have an actual main. Public static void main. Brackets. It's an array of strings, right? So now it works. And it prints the two entries, right? Now, let's see. Yes.
We never had system out inside the parentheses, do we?
This? Yes, we did. All the time. Assignment 2 and 3 and those things.
Inside?
Wait. System.out, right, gets you that value, right? We had it in the main for assignment 2 and things like that. Maybe you didn't think about it that way. It just gets you the value of the out variable of the system.class. It's a static variable of the system.class. There's nothing magical, right? It all builds from the same basic blocks. There's a class called system, and system.out is a static variable of type print string.
Since print all has a void return type, you do like this?
It has a void return type, which means I cannot do anything with whatever it returns, right? So I can't do int a equals, right? Now, I need to call it like this because it takes a variable of type print string. So I need to pass it some variable of type print string, right? Whether it's system.out or something else. I could do stuff like get phone. And use basically the same for loop, right? And then what the return is what's there. Kind of the trick is reserving an array that is bigger and then having the number of entries, right? As a separate variable rather than using the length of the array. And some of you already done assignment 8, so you use that trick. Some of you didn't, so I wanted to make sure to mention it so that it's not a trick, so that it's super easy, right? If you have attempted assignment 8, then this makes sense, right? Any questions? No? You're back into how to do classes and stuff? Yeah? Cool. So let's go cover cool stuff. First, interfaces and polymorphism. Depending on how you think about things, and when we are implementing objects, we sometimes think about implementers as implementers. If you are a client, right, you may not care how it's implemented. I don't give a hoot how it's implemented, right? All I care about is the public stuff, the public methods that you have, right? And that's it. If you do your getters and setters, right, then all I have access to are public methods. I don't care which instance variables you have. I don't even know what they are, right? You could name them differently. You could do other kinds of things. So all I really know is your public methods, right? And that's enough. If you define the right public methods, then I can call you, and I don't care how you implemented it, right? I can switch my hat, and now I'm a client of the class, and I don't care how it's implemented. They could do whatever they want as long as they give me these methods. Does that idea make sense? And we do that with stuff. Let's do Java REPL. I can do random r equals new random. Is that the right thing? Yay! I can call next int and it gives me random integers, right? What instance variable does this random class have? What instance variables does it have? I call next int and it gives me different values all the time, right? What instance variables does it have? I don't know, right? I don't have the faintest clue. I can probably go find stuff in the documentation. A lot of this stuff is open source, so I could actually go look at the code, but for the most part, I don't give a hoot. I call next int and it gives me an int, and I call next float, right? Maybe. Gives me a float. It's magic, right? It's magical enough. I don't care how many instance variables it has or anything like that. Does that idea make sense? I just care about the methods that it supports and that I can call, and life is good. That idea makes sense. I only care about the interface of the class, whatever I can interact with as a client. In Java, I can define an interface, a bunch of public methods, and then later on define classes that implement that interface, and the client code only talks about the interface, never talks about the class, and then I can actually change the interface, change the class, sorry, the implementation class, without, and have the same interface. So that idea makes some sense. So I could have, for example, what would be a good interface? Well, yeah, shapes are good. I could have a shape class, right? And the shape class knows stuff about itself, like its area and its perimeter and how to draw itself on the screen and things like that, right? Then I could have different kinds of shapes, like rectangles and circles, and they would print themselves in different ways. I don't need to know how they print themselves. I just create them and then call stuff on the shape. Does that idea make sense? Now let's go look at the actual syntax for that kind of stuff. Imagine we are doing school geometry, right, or graphics or something like that. I'm gonna teach kids how to calculate area and perimeter, right? Could define a rectangle class. If you're a rectangle, I'll define two things, my width and my height. I'll define a constructor, rectangle, and then I don't even define getters for width and height. I just define get area, get perimeter, and toString. And this looks a lot like at least a piece of the assignment. But
You don't define weight and height?
I define width and height, but I don't define methods get width and set width, and I don't define methods get height and set height. I don't define my getters and my setters, right? I do need to define the variables, right? So imagine that this is what I do. I could define a circle class kind of the same way. I have a radius, then I have get area, get perimeter, and toString, right? I defined it that way, but they're basically the same stuff. I have get area and get perimeter and toString, right? Java gives me a way of defining something that represents this stuff, so that I can say any class that has get area, get perimeter, and toString. Does that idea make sense? What I can do is define an interface that I'm going to call iShape that defines get area, which returns a double and takes no arguments, and get perimeter, which returns a double and takes no arguments. I could also define toString, but that one is already defined in object, so I don't really need to. Does that make sense?
So you create the interface and then you will use the methods above?
Yes, but my code is going to look interesting. Let me cut and paste stuff into here. Let me call this shapes. Need to change this stuff so it stops producing manure. Public, static, void main, lowercase. This guy, right? Let me do this. For now, let me define it. Shall we define it outside? Yeah, why not, right? New class, and I'm going to call it rectangle. In my main class, I can do stuff like this. And then right? And this would print 200. Yay. Does that make sense? There's nothing fancy here, right? I can just define my class. No biggie, right? Let me create one for circle. I can go here to shapes. Can you guys read, or shall I make it again, view, and do this horrible thing? The problem is that it doesn't. Right, I have circle, I have my main, and here I can do circle C equals new circle 10, and then I can do this. Right? Life is good. If I print it, I would get 200 and 314 or something like that, right? Right? Nothing fancy here, no magic. We just define classes. Now let's do magic. I can define an interface, which I need to make it, and I'm going to call it iShape. This is actually not, there is no standard in Java. C# has this thing about naming your interface with an I at the beginning, and I tend to use it because it makes sense to me. It doesn't matter what you call it, right? here, what I can do is take this stuff from here. Put it here. I'm just defining the interface, so I don't have this stuff, right? I don't have any implementation. And actually, in interfaces, doesn't make any sense to define any private stuff. So by default, everything is public. I think you can now define private stuff, but seldom used. Does this idea make sense? I'm just saying an eye shape is something that has a get area and a get perimeter. Right? Now we go to the magic. If in here I say implements eye shape, now in my main, instead of saying rectangle R, I can say shape S1, or sorry, not shape, eye shape. And when I run it, I get the exact same thing, right? Big deal. I can use eye shape, right? Instead of rectangle as the name. I still need to use rectangle here, right? Well, if I do the same on a circle, and go back here, I can use eye shape, right? We call it S2. Magical. Well, what I can do, which is magical, is this. Define an array of shapes, right? Where some of them are circles, some of them are rectangles. And now I can use Isn't this cool? This allows me to make my code much more generic, right? I don't know how many things implement eye shape, right?
You show it with regular for loop also?
Yes, sure. What's a regular for loop? I less than what? Not 2. Yes, shapes.length, right? The name of my class, my interface is iShape. My name of my variable is shapes, right? Does this make sense? Is this magical or what?
So, for example, if in the one company they have different products, and it helps them to with iShape they bring all the information of the product they want. They don't need to create one object for each product.
Wait, maybe. Normally, let's if you have products of the same type, right? You wouldn't use an interface, right? You could define a class product that has name and price, and you would have different instances of product in your database or something like that, right? You don't need more than one class to represent that, right? However, the thing is what happens when you're Amazon, right? And you sell CDs and books and other stuff, right? Then how do you represent it? One way is represented as just products, and I put the same thing, right? So every product has an ID, a title, and a description, and that's it, and a price, right? And then I don't distinguish between CDs and books, right? Right? Yeah, sort of kind of work, right? I may not want to do that because I want for a CD, I may want to put the interpreter and the all the songs that it has and things like that. For a book, I may want to put the author, maybe other stuff, right? So what do I do? Or what can I do? I define an interface product, right? That has the things that are common to all of them. Maybe an ID, a title, a description, and a price, for example, right? Then I would define, and we'll talk about in a second, maybe I define it as a class product. And then I define a subclass CD that has those four fields, but also has an array of performers, an array of songs, right? And then I may also define a subclass of product called book that has an ISBN and a bunch of other stuff. And then another subclass with different things. So that would be what this would enable me to do. And I could treat it in different places as just a product. So maybe on the listing page on Amazon, right? And it's not propaganda. Amazon happens to be kind of the default store, right? I work there too, but sort of, kind of. Let's look for what stuff. Beauty and the Beast. So when I'm doing this, right, I probably want to just list the basic stuff, right? So I just list the title and the price. Although actually they do this kind of stuff, right? But and then once I get in there, it may list more stuff. So maybe on my category page, I treat them all as products. And then on my product detail page, I treat each one individually or something like that. So that enables me to do some code that deals with them as just products, and then some code where I go inside and say, okay, now this is a CD, so this is what I'm going to display. Does that idea make sense? Like I have some common stuff and some special stuff. That is kind of the other example. Or if you think about the university systems, we deal with people and different kinds of people. We probably deal with person, right? If we were modeling this and we're trying to do it, people have standard stuff, have a date of birth, a name, right? And then for faculty, we keep different stuff. For faculty, we keep their social. For you guys, we don't. Maybe we do, but right? And for you, we keep payment information because we want to build you stuff. You give us money. For faculty, it's different because the university gives us money, right? That kind of stuff. So you could have a class person that represents all kinds of people, and then subclasses for students, faculty, other kinds of stuff, maybe vendors or whatever else.
And I should connect all the subclasses together.
Yes, the interface, right? iShape defines the things that every subclass would have. Does that idea make sense? In this case, it's an interface. It cannot define any data, or it shouldn't define any data. I think now you can in Java, but and it only defines public methods, right? I'm only declaring the methods. I'm only saying what their name and interface is. So I don't put any code. I don't put any braces. I put a semicolon, right? This guy. In my classes, I need to say that I implement this thing. If not, the compiler will not let me. And I probably want to do an override on the methods to have the compiler help with me not messing up. So if I do add override, and then I have a different thing in dummy, for example, it's going to tell me, no, you're not overriding that thing, right? If I don't implement the interface, I also get a compiler error, right? Because I don't have the methods that I should if I'm implementing this thing, right? If I don't say that I implement it, then even though I have the right methods, it won't let me use it in main. So I need to explicitly declare here, I want to be treated as an I shape. Does this idea make sense? This really cool idea is called polymorphism. Many forms, right? This is actually parametric inheritance polymorphism, I think. Parametric is generics. What happens here in my main, right? What method gets called when I call s.getArea? Which piece of code gets executed? Yes, right? It depends on what the class of S actually is. At compile time, right, the compiler doesn't know which one is going to execute. Maybe the one for rectangle, maybe the one for circle. Maybe actually one for other things, right? Because there may be 20 other classes that implement I-shape. Does that make sense? And so this is really cool. It's called polymorphism. It's one of the basics of object-oriented programming, right? We have inheritance, polymorphism, and encapsulation. That's kind of the basic things about object-oriented programming. This is really cool because I don't need to do, I can do less code, right? In many ways. I basically avoid all sorts of if statements, right? Does this idea make sense? Is this cool or what? What? Okay. This is really, really cool, right? Although we normally, for this class, it's probably too much. You could actually inherit from interfaces, right? In order to say that you inherit, you say extends. So I could have an interface I shape with area that only has get area, another one I shape with perimeter, and then I shape extends I shape with area and I shape with perimeter, so it gets this one and this one. Unless you're defining libraries, you're probably doing it too much if you try to do these things. But, right, sometimes you need these kinds of things and kind of bigger hierarchies. Does this idea make sense? Let's do another example. And I don't want to do too many with shapes because your assignment's about shapes. So let me do expressions. Imagine that you're evaluating expressions like three plus five plus eight and stuff like that, right? How do we represent this? Right? We represent it with kind of a parse tree, right? How do we want? Let's do it the right way. Oh no, we cannot do it the right way. For now, let's use only constants, right? Constants and operators, right? So I'm going to have only one method, get value, right? Now, I'm going to have a class constant. If I'm a constant, like the number 3 or the number 5, right? What do I have? I'm going to have only one piece of data, right? Let's assume that we're only doing doubles, right? Maybe private. How do I evaluate myself? Let's say that I implement expression. What's my value? Wow, my value. Right? Life is good. I have an expression. Woohoo! Now, so if I'm a sum, like this 3 plus 5, right? How many pieces of data do I need to keep track of? 2, right? What are those 2 things? Well, they're expressions, and I don't know what the heck they are, right? So I could consider them just as expressions, right? So I'm going to have expression left, right. We can call it E1 and E2 or something like that. Now I need to do yes. It's an interface. Does it make sense to call it I expression and change it? It's because of the name of the interface. This is, right? This defines a type expression. Just like this defines a type constant. Right? Should we use I expression? Or haha, refactor, rename. I expression. Enter. Ha! And it goes and changes it everywhere. Woohoo! Isn't that cool? IDEs sometimes are good. No, you can always just do. So how do I calculate the value of a sum? Whatever my left plus whatever my right, right? Return does this make sense? Should we call it sum and product and then subtraction, and or should we call it plus and minus and times? And let me refactor this. Plus. So in here I can do I expression new plus new constant 3 5 I need to make this guy static because they should really be defined in different files, but I'm being lazy. So what would this print? Hopefully 8. Actually, didn't print anything. Why? Because I didn't freaking print anything, right? System.out expression dot get value. Now we will print 8. Isn't this cool? All of my binary operators are kind of the same, right? Just need to change this, right? So now I can do this guy as maybe new minus 3 comma new constant 7 Sorry? I'm adding, so this is 3 minus 7 plus 5. Right? Yes, no, maybe. Actually, ooh. Let's go do other fancy stuff here. When we do define an expression, right, how do we transform it into a string, right? We could use toString, but let me actually introduce other stuff since we have time. Haha! Prefix toString. Sorry. This is the interface, so I don't do anything, right? If I'm a constant, I just print myself. If I'm a plus, I print plus the actual let me use the parentheses. Left dot prefix toString plus and the same thing here except with a minus, right? Again, right, I define it on my interface, I define it on all of the implementer classes, and life is good. What did I mess up? Value? So that's 3 minus 7 plus 5, right? You have kind of parse trees, right? This is how it would get parsed if you do something like 5 plus or 3 minus 7 plus 5, right? Got one. Yay! And there is 3 ways of defining expressions. You can do prefix notation, which is this one. You can do infix, which is what we normally use. And you can do postfix, where you always put the operator at the end. With prefix notation, you always need parentheses. With postfix, you never need parentheses. Yeah, and with infix, you sometimes need parentheses to modify. So we could do infix toString, right? In infix, you put the operator inside the string, right? If I'm a constant, I just print myself regardless, right? If I'm a binary operator, I would just do this. And if I am this guy, let me cheat and copy this guy, make it minus. And I'm printing the parentheses always just so we don't get confused with precedence. Right now it doesn't terribly matter, but what happened? Oh, wait. This guy's I'm calling prefix to string. It should be infix to string. Let's see. Is this cool or what? You could go defining all the other things and getting all the expressions you ever needed. Isn't this cool? Idly? Potentially? This is a tiny piece of how you end up implementing an interpreter or compiler or something like that. But it's also a good example of interfaces and implementing those interfaces. Here's my interface, and I'm implementing it in different ways. Any questions about interfaces and classes that implement them? No? Let me quickly, and we'll go over this again, and probably with this same example next class. But you can also inherit from classes. When you have a class, you can define a generic class that has some of this stuff, some of the data, and some of the behavior. And the product class, right, would be a great one to do. And then define subclasses that inherit all the data and all that behavior, but also define their own variations and potentially define, override some of that behavior. Does that make sense, Daniel? I see you disagreeing. No. Cool. You were nodding. No, it's cool. I actually like when you guys give me feedback. If you don't give me feedback, then I'm assuming that all is great and I keep going, right? And if that's not right, then class inheritance can actually be. We have now a everything should be object oriented kind of thing, and so many people misuse class inheritance. We shouldn't use it as much. It has its uses, but um, for the most part, you can live with interface inheritance and almost never have class inheritance. But if we wanted to do people and employees and students and things like that, we would have a class base person that has name and date of birth, a constructor, and getters. We could have an employee class that extends this base person. Sorry, when we have inheritance, the class that you inherit from is called the base class, so that's why the name of base person rather than just person. Would make perfect sense to just call it person. For an employee, I'm going to keep the SSN. I have a constructor that has 3. I could do it different ways, but one way is calling the constructor of my base class by using the special keyword super. I'm calling the constructor of my base class that takes 2 things, and then I'm assigning my SSN. By doing this, every employee also has a name and a date of birth, and methods get name and get date of birth. Does that make sense? And so that allows me to define one class and then several subclasses and kind of have all that common stuff together. Also, I could have stuff that operates on people and stuff that can only operate on employees and things like that. Does that idea make sense? Some sense? We could, let me go do, is this example reasonable? No? The expressions, does it confuse you?
This one, we practice.
Okay, let me do this. Public I'm gonna define a class binary binary operator and that thing is gonna have let's see if we can do it left and right and operator, right? I'm gonna say that this guy implements I expression. I have this guy. Now I need to say abstract. An abstract class doesn't have to implement all of its methods. And then I need these two guys. Abstract. I could define these two guys. This is prefix to string. Instead of plus, I can print operator. And the same-ish for infix. Oops, so instead of this, right? I do and I can define this. Actually, this protected is something that I can access and also my subclasses can access. Let's do string operator, I expression left, I expression right. Now this allows me to change this to just, instead of implement I expression, extends binary operator. I don't need this guy. I can do, instead of this, super of plus left right. Sorry? Super means call the constructor of my superclass. So in this case, my superclass is binary operator. So, and I don't need to define these two guys at all. Because I'm calling this constructor. This constructor takes a string and two I expressions. So I'm passing, right? I'm calling that particular constructor with those parameters. So this should hopefully work and print exactly the same thing. And it would allow me to do the same with minus, right? So instead of this, I would do extends binary operator, and then I just call the constructor. Sorry? Private where? Oh yeah, you're right. I don't need these guys, right? And then I don't need these guys either because I'm getting them from this class, from my superclass, right? So by using inheritance, I make my classes a lot shorter. Because all the common stuff, which is this, is now in this superclass, right? And it would make a lot more sense if I define 10 other operators, right? The next time when I define times then that makes it a lot easier, right? And the more things that I have that belong to that common class, the more I saved on code and on thinking, right? If I were to define a prefix or a postfix thing for printing it, I just need to define it in one place, right? Isn't this cool? This is cool, right? Please tell me that it's cool. It allows you to make cooler stuff with less code, right? At the cost of complicating your life, right? So that's the balance. Your life becomes a little bit more complicated, but you work a lot less. What's going to make this look a lot less complicated? Do 100 of these, right? So when you get home, when you have a chance, go and define another operator or something like that, right? No. One second. The code is already posted. And the video will be posted, politicians promise. But the code is already there right now, since you reminded me, which is good. Let me stop.